Hello, my name is Leonard. This is the Symantec Enterprise Vault 10 for Exchange Administration, Lesson 5, Configuring Mailbox Archiving, Overview, and Policies. What we're starting in this section is that we've already installed the Enterprise Vault, we have configured the Enterprise Vault, and we have set up the Vault storage. So now we're ready to get into the actual mailbox archiving. We have 2 lessons on mailbox archiving. First is going to be Lesson 5. We'll do an overview of the archiving process, and we'll introduce the concepts of policies, specifically looking at the mailbox policy and the desktop policy. We will continue on in Lesson 6 for the mailbox archiving to get into the concept of provisioning and also the processing of the actual archived mail messages and how that works. In Lesson 5, we're going to go through and look at configuring the Exchange mailbox archiving prerequisites. We're going to do an Exchange mailbox archiving overview so that we can identify the various tasks, services, and processes that the Enterprise Vault uses for archiving the Exchange environment. We'll look at configuring our mailbox policies and determine what all goes into a mailbox policy, what all is available for configuration. And then we'll go through and we'll look at the desktop policies that are configurable as well. We will be revisiting the desktop policies in later lessons when we get into customizing the client application lessons. Starting off, we'll look at the configuring the Exchange mailbox archiving prerequisites. These are some things that we're going to look at that need to be configured on the Exchange servers themselves prior to us archiving items from the Exchange servers. So we're going to go through and look at the mailboxes themselves. We'll find out that we need to have some mailboxes placed on Exchange for Enterprise Vault to use. And then we'll also go through and start looking at what permissions do these mailboxes as well as the Enterprise Vault service account need in order to be able to allow Enterprise Vault to go to the Exchange server and retrieve these mail items so that Enterprise Vault can index and archive those items. So we're going to start off in that we're going to kind of try to ignore the concept that there's multiple Exchange servers out there. We have Exchange 2003, Exchange 2007, and Exchange 2010. So we're going to start off looking at some generic or general things that need to be done for all Exchange servers, no matter what version you're working with. So the first thing we're looking at here is you need to create a system mailbox on each one of the Exchange servers. This system mailbox has certain restrictions. Nothing is allowed to access or use this system mailbox other than Enterprise Vault. Also, you are not allowed to hide this mailbox from the global address list. What we see a lot of times is if we do have to have a service mailbox, we don't want our end users to see that mailbox, so we hide it. You can't do that for this service or this system mailbox. And also, the account can't be disabled. If you do hide it or you disable it, you will cause Enterprise Vault to fail the capability of archiving for that particular Exchange server. And then you also must go through and assign the necessary permissions to the Exchange server. Now, the permissions themselves are a little bit unique based upon the Exchange server that you're going to be installing Enterprise Vault onto or having Enterprise Vault archived to. So first we're going to look at the configuring the Exchange servers for Exchange 2000 and 2003. You need to go through and configure the permissions that are specified in the installing and configuring guide, as well as the setting up Exchange archiving guide for the Vault service account. And you can use the Microsoft Exchange System Manager to perform this. Basically, you're going to be setting all the permissions to allow. Also, there may be certain circumstances where you have to set the permissions both at the Exchange organization and the Exchange administrative group level. Now, these particular settings are spelled out in detail in the documentation, so make sure you follow the documentation to set up those permissions. If you do have a mixed environment, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later, where you have combinations of Exchange 2003, 2007, and 2010, we will find out that we do have a PowerShell script that you can run, and not only will it set the permissions for the Exchange 2007 and 2010, but it will also set them for 2003. So in a mixed environment, you can use that script. But if you've only got Exchange 2000 and or Exchange 2003 environment, you will have to manually go through and set up those permissions that are specified in the documentation. For your Exchange Server 2007, if you've got just Exchange 2007 servers, you need to grant the Send As permission on the Enterprise Vault system mailbox to the Vault service account. Also, we have given a script that will help you set up the individual permissions that are needed on the Exchange server. The name of this script is called the Set EV Exchange Permission PS1. This is a PowerShell script that you will run through the Exchange Management Shell. If you're going to be using public folders, if you're going to be using Outlook 2003 and earlier, then you need to set up a public folder on the Exchange Server 2007. By default, Exchange Server 2007 did not come with a public folder, so you need to do that in order to allow the Enterprise Vault to publish its organizational forms. For your Exchange Server 2010, you need to create a mailbox for the Vault service account. If you already have a mailbox for the Vault service account and it's on an earlier version than the Exchange 2010, you need to move it to the Exchange 2010 server. And when you move it, there's going to be additional configuration settings required. And those are in the documentation. That's what the note there is speaking to. Also, if you are using a database availability group, which became available with the Exchange 2010 environment, you need to make sure that you have that Enterprise Vault system mailbox on every Exchange server in the database availability group. And you still need to grant the Send As permission on the Exchange system mailboxes on all those different Exchange servers to the Vault service account. Then you're going to set up the permissions by running the set EV exchange permissions.ps1. This is the same version that you ran for the Exchange 2007. And you're also going to go through for Exchange 2010, run an additional PowerShell script through the Exchange Management Shell. And this one's going to be set EV throttling policy.ps1. Now what's happened with Exchange 2010 is that to try to balance the load and to minimize the number of connections so one user doesn't use up all the connections to your Exchange environment, they have a throttling policy. Well, for the Vault service account, that limitation of the throttling policy does not allow sufficient concurrent connections for Enterprise Vault to do its job. So we're going to create a custom Exchange throttling policy by running the set EV throttling policy PowerShell script. Next, we want to look at an overview of the actual Exchange mailbox archiving process to help us identify the different tasks and services and processes that are occurring to get our Enterprise Vault environment archived, or get our Exchange environment archived into Enterprise Vault. We're going to start off with the directory service. We've mentioned this in previous lessons. The directory service is responsible for maintaining all the configuration settings associated with the Enterprise Vault sites that belong to that particular directory. The directory service is going to have a directory database that it's going to communicate with. Then we're going to have the storage service. The storage service will interact with the directory service and also the Vault Store database as well as the fingerprint database to be able to manage both the storage and retrieval of items as necessary for Enterprise Vault. We also have the indexing service that will be responsible for, once the storage service is converting the items into either HTML or text, indexing all those items based upon the indexing level that you have, in fact, specified. And then to actually go through and start setting up the rules that are associated with the mailbox archiving process, as well as to actually do the mailbox archiving runs, we're going to set up the Exchange mailbox archiving task. Now, the Exchange mailbox archiving task will be interacting with the directory service and the storage service to be able to find the various vaults and archives, as well as to determine which users are in which groups and which policies apply to those users. And part of that's going to be the provisioning task as well, which we'll discuss in the next lesson. So here we're just trying to show you that the policies are associated with the Exchange mailbox archiving task. Then we need to get into the actual process of archiving the items that were on the Exchange server. So the Exchange mailbox archiving task will do that in conjunction with the storage service, and it'll actually store those items, as we talked about earlier when we did the fingerprint example in a previous lesson, store those items to the Vault Store partitions and make the correct entries in both the directory database, fingerprint database, and Vault Store database. Also, as part of this process of archiving the mail item, for each individual mailbox that is archived, we will place a hidden message. And we'll be placing things such as the policy settings, retention categories for your mailbox in that hidden message. And we'll be exploring that hidden message in more detail later in the lesson. And then lastly, we have the option of, instead of automatically archiving the items from the Exchange mailboxes, if a particular user is running one of the clients, Outlook or Outlook Web Access, and they manually archive, we have to be able to support the capability of manually archiving those items. Now, we also have to have within this whole process that doesn't have a separate pop-up is the ability to synchronize all of the different settings and all of the different permissions between the Enterprise Vault environment and the Exchange server environment. So that if there are new mailboxes that have been added to the Exchange server environment, or we've changed policies in the Enterprise Vault environment, that type of information is interchanged between Exchange and the hidden messages to guarantee that everything is synchronized, as well as permissions is another thing that gets synchronized as part of that process. We will find out that synchronization can take place automatically as well as manually. So let's go and look at the Exchange mailbox archiving task itself. It's going to archive the items from the mailboxes either automatically based upon a schedule or in response to a manual request. The automatic archiving runs at scheduled times to scan the target mailboxes to determine if there's anything that meets the mailbox policy, which will have the archiving rules in it. And we'll be looking at those mailbox policies and rules later in this lesson. Or you can go through the mailbox archiving task in the Enterprise Vault Administration Console, right-click on it, and one of your options will be to run now. And when you select the Run Now option, you'll be able to determine one of 4 running modes. These include archive and shortcut processing, which is the default selection, as well as just archiving, just shortcut processing, or running the task in report mode. In the next lesson, we'll get into more details about the specifics of what each one of these run modes brings to the table. Also, there's going to be an issue when you're setting up the Exchange mailbox archiving task and what types of items you have available to that task based upon whether you're using the full Exchange client, which uses DCOM, the Distributed Component Object Model, or if it's using the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP. So setting this up, we've broken it down into phases to try to help manage everything that we need to do to get this mailbox archiving off the ground. So in phase 1, we're going to verify our configuration and requirements. In phase 2, we're going to define our targets and tasks. In phase 3, we're going to create our policies and retention categories. We'll define them here. We'll actually discuss how they work in more detail in the lesson 6. We'll also go through and look at defining provisioning groups, which again, we'll look at that process of creating the provisioning groups and doing the actual provisioning in lesson 6. And then we'll get into phase 5, which will configure and schedule and actually run the Enterprise Vault mailbox archiving task. So first is verifying the settings in phase 1. One of the first things that we need to do is open up the properties associated with the directory itself and verify that they are correctly set. You also need to verify that we've created the indexing locations, and in an earlier lesson we talked about that being one of the things that you would typically configure prior to configuring the Vault storage infrastructure. You need to verify that you have at least one Enterprise Vault storage group and an Enterprise Vault store, and that there's a partition available for archiving. And on each one of the individual Exchange servers, you want to verify that you did in fact create the Enterprise Vault system mailbox, as well as set up the correct permissions. Now, the index server properties and creating the locations, you're going to see as we go through the slides here, we're going to put a little asterisk next to some of the different types of things that you can do with the Getting Started wizard. We had mentioned in an earlier lesson that some things can be configured with the Getting Started wizard as well as the Enterprise Vault Administration Console, and we're going to concentrate in the course on the Enterprise Vault Administration Console. But we will be pointing out things that can be done with the Getting Started wizard. Now, the first thing when we open up the directory properties that we want to look at is going to be the message classes. So you can see here we have the directory on the Enterprise Vault server named EV Server. That's actually the server alias. We go to the Exchange Message Class tab, and you can see the default message classes that are included or are available for archiving. These include things such as appointments, contacts, notes, reports. You can, in fact, you'll notice that there is an add button there. You can create your own custom message classes if you've got some kind of a mail or application that has custom types of classes inside of it. Now, once you've specified the message classes that are available within the directory to all the Enterprise Vault sites, you then switch gears, and when you go to the mailbox policy, you'll tell it which actual classes you wish to archive. So this is one of the first steps at determining what will be archived. So in this example, we've decided to only archive 3 of the available message classes in the default Exchange mailbox policy. And that's the document, the note, and the post. Still in phase 2, we said we wanted to define the targets and tasks. And the first thing that we need to define is a domain. Then once you define the actual domain, you will then go through and create the Exchange server targets. As part of creating the Exchange server targets, you can, in fact, create the mailbox archiving task and the provisioning task automatically. You don't have to do that. You can configure it manually. And then you can also configure the individual settings, schedule, and synchronization for the Exchange mailbox archiving task. For the Exchange domain, in this particular example on the slide, it's showing you that we've gone to the site, we've navigated under our targets and under Exchange, and we've right-clicked on Exchange and said Add a new domain. Once we've selected Add a new domain, we specify the domain name, and we need to be able to communicate with a global catalog server in order to be able to access that particular domain. So our domain name is the example.com. Once you've created your domain name, you then go through and specify the Exchange servers that belong to that particular domain. So in this example here, under our Exchange servers, we have one Exchange server named Server 1. Still within phase 2, you've got the adding the targets themselves. So again, we've gone through and looked at the picture on the previous slide to go through and talk about, once we've added the domain target, how we can add the individual Exchange servers. And as part of that new Exchange server wizard, we can create the Exchange mailbox archiving task. As part of that wizard, we will specify the name of the system mailbox that we created on the Exchange server. And as a reminder, if you are using an Exchange database availability groups, make sure that you define a target for each one of the Exchange servers that are in the Exchange database availability group. Then if you create the Exchange mailbox archiving task, you can, again, we talked about as part of the previous wizard, having it do it for you automatically. If not, you can just navigate down to the administrative console, to the Enterprise Vault servers, right-click on the task and select as you wish to create a new Exchange mailbox task, and then specify the Exchange server at which to associate this particular Exchange mailbox archiving task to. There's going to be one Exchange server associated with each Exchange mailbox task. Moving on to phase 3 is to create the policies. You're going to define the mailbox policies, and in the mailbox policies you're going to determine the archiving rules and actions and the shortcut content and deletion. We're going to cover those in more detail later in this particular lesson. You can also specify the desktop policies. Typically the desktop policies deal with the user's user interface, and you can set them up with custom settings for Outlook and Outlook Web Access, as well as Vault Cache and Virtual Vault. And then we also have some advanced options for all of those as well. You can define the retention categories by specifying the archive retention period for a particular retention category. And you can actually use ones that are already created, or if there's not one that's already created and you have the correct permissions, you can create your own retention category. And again, in Lesson 6, we will get into more detail about how retention categories and expiry work in the mailbox archiving process. For Phase 4, we'll get into the provisioning concept. When we get into provisioning, you need to create a provisioning group. The provisioning groups can be specified based upon individual users, Windows security and or distribution groups. You can specify it based upon Active Directory organizational units. You can create your own custom lightweight directory access protocol queries or LDAP queries. Or again, you can be as simple or as broad as just say that this particular provisioning group applies to your entire Exchange organization. Now, as you're creating these provisioning groups, you're going to assign policies to the provisioning groups. This includes the mailbox policy, desktop policy, the retention categories, and the PST migration policy. You will also have the option when you're creating your provisioning group to be able to specify a particular vault store that you wish to use for this particular provisioning group. And then to actually get the provisioning group implementation, you will run the provisioning task. And we'll get into that in more detail about how to set up and create the provisioning groups and to run the provisioning task in Lesson 6. In Phase 5, we're going to go through and configure and start all the required tasks, which include starting and running the provisioning task. Once we've run the provisioning task, we will then be able to enable the mailboxes that are required for archiving. We will then go through and start and run the Exchange mailbox archiving task, either manually or automatically, and then we can confirm that everything is in fact working by using Vault Store reports. Now, going in and looking at, once I've created this Exchange mailbox archiving task, to be able to go in and actually look at the individual properties of it, we can just right-click on the task and open up the Properties page. On the General tab of the Exchange mailbox archiving task, you will see the name of the Enterprise Vault that this task is associated with. It'll give you the name of the computer on which the task is actually running or scheduled to run on. It will also give you the name of the Exchange server from which the items are going to be archived. And again, remember that we are associating individual Exchange mailbox archiving tasks with individual Exchange servers. The settings on this page can specify whether to run the task in report mode or to specify the startup type. And the supported startup types include automatic, which means it starts automatically when the task controller service starts, manually, which means I can go in and right-click on it and select Start to start it up, or I can actually disable it so that I don't want it to start at this particular point in time, and I can go and change it to either automatic or manual and start it at a later time. If you do run it in report mode, this would typically be either during troubleshooting or initial setup to try to determine what's going to be archived before you actually start archiving items, and it will generate a report that will tell you the items that are going to be archived. Now, still dealing with the concept of the Exchange mailbox archiving task, and in this particular case it's for the Exchange server named Server 1. We've moved away from the General tab onto the Settings tab. And with the Settings tab, we're looking at the section that talks about the settings. And the first setting we have there is the number of concurrent connections. This has to do with the resources that are going to be allocated for the Enterprise Vault to communicate with the Exchange server. Just as a warning for this, typically 5 is good enough. But if I have it set up for this, each one of these connections counts as a client access license, which means that if I have it set for 5 and I only have one mailbox archiving task, I'll have to have at least 5 client access licenses. If I change this to 10 or 20, I may have to go and verify that I have enough client access licenses available. The maximum number of items per target per pass to archive basically kind of evens out the archiving process so that I don't end up archiving everything from the first mailbox I get to, and I never get everything completed for the last mailbox that's in the archiving task. We're going to see here in a moment that we schedule this archiving task to run over a certain period of time. So therefore, if I don't get through everything, then I may have certain mailboxes that don't get anything archived. By setting a number of items to archive for each pass, for each target, I'm hoping that I can balance out that I'm at least getting some things archived for every target that I have available. And then you also need to specify the particular system mailbox that's associated with this Exchange archiving task, which again is associated with a specific Exchange server. If you need more detail about the individual settings that are in this particular tab, you can click the Help button, and you can see here an example of the help file that opens up that would explain those different settings in more detail. Also notice here, we'll come back to it more later, but this is also where we can set up the synchronization process to synchronize the settings that are configured in Enterprise Vault versus the items that exist in Exchange so that they're communicating. By default, it is set up to synchronize twice a day, once at midnight and once at midday. Configuring the task to run at a particular period in time, you can have it use the site schedule. In an earlier lesson, we talked about how to set up the site schedule. You can also go through and specify whether or not you wish it to run never or at the times that are highlighted in the site schedule. The archiving task processes mail until there are no more mailboxes to process or until the allotted window for archiving closes based upon the schedule. So again, we'll get into this in more detail a little bit later, but the idea here is that you need to do a variety of things at night when your users aren't accessing their mail environment. So therefore, you may set it up and back up the Exchange servers. Well, typically you would do your archiving runs first, then you could back up the archives, back up your Exchange servers, and you want to make sure that you give yourself enough time to do that archiving run before you start the backup process on your Enterprise Vault environment. Another property associated with the Enterprise Vault mailbox archiving task is the account that you're using to log on. It is typically going to be the Vault service account. However, you may find yourself in a security environment where you need to specify a different account. You can, in fact, do that through the Properties page. However, as a reminder, if you do run it as somebody other than the Vault service account, you're going to have to go back and run those scripts that we talked about earlier, the set EV exchange permissions and the set EV exchange throttling policy settings against that particular account. So just remember to go back and do those. And also don't forget the send as permissions and any other permissions based upon your Exchange organization's version. When you are scheduling, I kind of alluded to this already, but typically you can run it daily. However, based upon your load, you may need to run it on weekends or evenings. You want to fit the schedule so it doesn't overlap with any other processor-intensive type of a setting, such as Exchange, Enterprise Vault, or SQL backups. Fit it around the Exchange maintenance window because we will be communicating with Exchange as part of the synchronization process. You may want to set it up so it has minimal impact on the users themselves during their normal window or the normal window of use. And of course, if you are a global company, that's sometimes very hard because you have people working around the clock. But try to fit those times when they're less likely to be using it. And then give Enterprise Vault enough time. You can't go in there and think that if you're archiving the mailboxes of 10,000 users, that it's only going to take a couple of minutes to do that. So make sure, again, based upon some testing and stuff, you give yourself a reasonable window of opportunity to get your items archived. So as we mentioned before, one of the main things that we're dealing with when we're talking about the Exchange mailbox archiving task is setting up and configuring the policies that are associated with the provisioning groups, which will be set up and configured based upon the provisioning task. We're going to save the discussion of the configuring of the provisioning task and the creation of the provisioning groups for Lesson 6, but here we're going to look at the creation of the first mailbox policies and then the desktop policies that are going to be associated with those provisioning groups. First, a comparison of the mailbox and desktop policies. The mailbox policies are responsible for configuring the archiving actions, both the rule and the action itself. It's going to talk about what you're going to do with a shortcut, whether you're going to have one, not have one, what type of information is going to be maintained in that particular shortcut. We're also going to look at the age at which you wish to have those shortcuts deleted, because after a certain period of time, you may decide that you don't need to be taking up space in Outlook just for those shortcuts because users are probably not really using them anymore, so you can go ahead and delete those items. But for a desktop policy, this is going to be configuring the user interface, typically either on the toolbar for Outlook 2007 or maybe the ribbon in Outlook 2010, as well as the different menu options that may be available. And we'll find out that we can configure a variety of options for both Outlook, Outlook Web Access, Virtual Vault, and Vault Cache as well. So we're going to start off in this particular section working with the mailbox policy, and then we will have a separate section later in this lesson that deals with the individual desktop policies that we're going to use. So getting back to the mailbox policies, in order to create one, you navigate in your Enterprise Vault Administration Console, down from your directory, down through your site, and then you get to the Policies section. And then under your Exchange Policies, you'll right-click the mailbox and go to New Policy. When you create the policy itself, the only thing that's actually created is the name and the description of the policy. Once you've created the name and the description, you have to actually go and right-click on the policy, select the Properties to bring open the Properties dialog box, and once you've opened up that Properties dialog box, you can then go through and start configuring that particular mailbox policy based upon your anticipation of associating the mailbox policy with a particular group of people that will be assigned to your provisioning group. So in this example, we've created a mailbox policy, and we've named this mailbox policy leavers. So the idea is that we've got certain people that leave the company. And we know that the people who leave the company need a different mailbox policy than the people that are currently working at the company. So we're going to have different configuration settings. So to us, we've decided that it makes sense to configure a custom mailbox policy just for those people or group of people that are leaving the company. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Archiving Rules tab for the mailbox policy. And we can set up an archiving strategy first. And when we set up the archiving strategy, this is going to be either based upon age, based upon quota, or you can do a combination of basing it upon both age and quota. We're going to come back and look at this in more detail, the specifics of selecting the different options and how that's going to impact what actually gets archived a little bit later in this lesson. For your age-based, you can specify when to archive the items based upon them being older than a certain period of time. So in this particular example, we've selected that they're older than 3 months is when we want to start automatically archiving them. If you decide to select for quota-based type of a setting, what you want to do is you want to be able to go through and specify the amount of free space that's going to be in their Enterprise Vault mailbox archive based upon the amount of free space in that storage location. The next section that we want to look at is down under the override settings. Now, as the name implies, in the override settings section, we're going to override either age-based or the quota-based settings above. One of your options for setting that up is to archive items that are not younger than a certain period of time. So therefore, again, our assumption is that users are going to be actively accessing items that are new in their mailbox. So therefore, we're going to give them a certain period of time to do whatever they want to do with those items in their mailbox before we actually start the archiving process of those older items. Also, from the standpoint of allowing us to get better storage, we can go through and specify that we would like to start with items that are greater than a certain size. And in this particular case here, we're selecting that we wish to start with items that are greater than 5 megabytes. And you'll notice that it is in fact specified in kilobytes, and we specified 5,000, so the conversion makes that 5 megabytes. Also, we can go through and specify that we want to archive only messages with attachments. Again, the idea here is that most of the mail messages themselves are very small. They might be even smaller than that 20 kilobyte threshold for generating a fingerprint. So therefore, if they have an attachment, the likelihood is that the attachment will be the larger item. But notice that these settings override the settings above. So if I put a check mark and archive only messages with attachments, I will only archive the items with attachments until after I've specified everything is archived. Then I will go and start looking at my normal archiving strategy. Some considerations. If age and quota are combined, the way the policy is going to go through and apply the rules, the both quota rule and the age rule, is that it will do an age-based scan first of all the items that need to be archived to determine which items meet the age criteria, and it will try to archive all of those items, and then it will go back and look at the current free space on the location where those items are stored. If I've gone below the quota, I'm done. I don't need to do any additional archiving. However, if I haven't gone below the specified quota, then I will go ahead and start picking items based upon other criteria, usually oldest first, until I get down to that particular quota. So this example here, and we saw it on the previous slide, is to configure a rule to never archive items younger than 4 weeks, or to archive all items larger than 5 megabytes in size. And we're going to define a strategy to archive only the items that contain the attachments that meet that requirement. So we want to kind of set up or give you a graphic representation of what we're trying to accomplish here. So the first thing that we have is that we have that override which says never archive items younger than 4 weeks. So it doesn't matter if the particular item, and we run an archiving run tonight, if that item is not younger than or not older than 4 weeks old, I'm not going to consider it for archiving because that's an override. Our second override said to start with items that are larger than 5 megabytes in size. So I'm going to look at everything that is greater than 5 megabytes in size and bigger than or older than 4 weeks for archiving. Now what that does though is the age-based strategy comes back and says that I want to archive everything that's over 3 months, no matter what its size is. So you can see here that there's actually a little section in there that's older than 4 weeks, younger than 3 months, smaller than 5 megabytes, that is not going to get archived in this particular scenario. So again, you just got to kind of have to play with it maybe for a little while to start seeing where the overrides come into effect versus what your selected archiving strategy is, either age, quota, or a combination of both. So let's look at the example associated with the quota-based strategy. Again, we have the override set to where it's set to not archive anything younger than 4 weeks. We have the override to say that once the archiving run does in fact start running, we're going to archive everything over 5 megabytes. Now our inbox there on the far right represents that an inbox is completely full. So once we've done that archiving, we start archiving the items greater than 4 weeks for our archiving run. We're now going to go through and start archiving items smaller than the 5 megabytes. Again, this is quota only. All right? We don't have that requirement that we had previously based upon size. So I'm just going to start archiving everything that's greater than 4 weeks and smaller than 5 megabytes until I get that free space. Once I reach whatever percentage of free space that I've specified in my inbox, then it will stop. All right? So now I picked up, as opposed to the previous example of doing just age-based, of missing out things between 4 weeks and 3 months that are smaller than 5 megabytes, I've now captured those with my quota-based environment. Now, wouldn't it be nice if I only had to have one or the other? It never seems to work out that way in the computer world. It always seems to be a combination or compromise. So therefore, in my particular company here, we've come up with a couple different use cases. First is Rita. Rita keeps her mailbox within the quota, but she has an awful lot of old data, but it's never really archived because it never gets above that quota threshold. So because it never gets above the quota threshold, it doesn't get archived, so they seem to just stay in her mailbox forever. However, we have a different user named Juan. Juan is a very heavy Exchange user who constantly exceeds their quota. So therefore, because they constantly exceed their quota, they'd be archiving all the time. So the idea is that because we do have a mixture of users of Exchange, which means we're going to have a mixture of needs for archiving, you need to have the option to be able to include both quota and age-based together. So how do I go through and configure these different settings for the mailbox archiving rules and actions? This again is on the individual Exchange mailbox policy. And in this particular example, we switched to a different policy. We're now looking at a mailbox policy named Legal Department Mailbox Policy. And for our Archiving Actions tab, we're looking at deleting the original item after archiving it. So we are saying that we do want to do that. So therefore, in the mailbox, it'll get deleted, and it will ultimately only exist in the Enterprise Vault environment. Do we want to do we want to create a shortcut to that particular archived item after archiving? So again, this is showing you the fact that you do have an option of choosing to display shortcuts or not choosing to display shortcuts. And then do you wish to archive unread items? In this case here, everything that shows up in your unread folder, maybe you never got to it, maybe it was spam, whatever, but do you want to go ahead and archive those items as well? This is showing you the default settings. So by default, we assume that you want to delete the original item after archiving, you want to create a shortcut to the item after archiving, but you typically would not wish to archive items that haven't been read. Now down towards the bottom, you will notice that there is what's called the overall lock. This is going to force the users to use this policy in target settings for their mailbox archiving, which we will show you later that based upon the client, you may have the capability of creating custom archiving rules and archiving actions if you have permission. But if you set the lock here, they will not have that permission. This is also being used to set the overall lock for the archiving strategy, which we saw on a previous slide. Now, if you remove the overall lock, then what happens is the individual locks for each archiving action, as well as the lock for the archiving strategy, will become ungrayed out, and then you'll be able to set those individually. So that's what the overall lock does for us. All right, another thing that we said that we could perform when we were going through and doing or setting up the mailbox policies was the shortcut content and shortcut deletion. This is in addition to setting up the archiving rules and the archiving actions that we performed earlier. We're going to start off going back to that leavers mailbox policy that we had looked at earlier in the lesson, and we're going to go to the shortcut content tab. The first thing we're looking at is the recipient information. You got the option of including the recipient information. The shortcut will always contain the from and to subject information. So therefore, with from, to, and subject information being in there, there might be some recipient information that is not displayed. By placing a check mark in the Include Recipient Information checkbox, it will also include the details of any carbon copy or blind carbon copy recipients in the shortcut itself. The next section deals with the shortcut body. And within the shortcut body, the first section deals with the content of the shortcut body. And we have three different options there. We can select none, which means that we do not wish to have anything in the actual body of the shortcut. Or we can go through and say that we wish to use the message body, which will take whatever was in the original mail message and include that in the shortcut. Or we can go through and customize the shortcut. Once you select Customize, the additional options under Shortcut Body will become available. If you select None or Use Message Body, you won't have the option to select Include Banner, Include Link, or set the characters setting or the Display Attachments As setting. So in our example, we're going to select Customize. So then we have the option to include a banner. This banner goes across the top of the shortcut, and it can display custom text, which we'll be looking at how to set that up a little bit later. And we can also go through and include a link to the archived item. Now, if we're using shortcuts or we're using Virtual Vault, we don't need typically a, let me say that. When you're using the shortcut, you don't have to actually have a link. The shortcut itself will get you back to the capability of retrieving the message. However, if you're using a non-MAPI client, such as something other than Outlook, then you may want to include the link so that you can click on that item to be able to retrieve it. But if you're not, or if you're always working with a MAPI client, you don't have to include that link. We can also customize the message that's displayed for that link, which we'll look at later. Another option that you have available as part of the shortcut body, if you select it Customize, is the number of characters to include. So again, you want part of the message body to kind of give you a look or an overview of what's contained in that message body to help you determine if you need to retrieve the original item, so you can include a certain number of characters. And then as far as attachments associated with the message, you also have the option of being able to either display them as a list or display them as a link. If you display them as a link, you will click on that item to retrieve it. If you display it as a list, you can just see the attachments, but you can't retrieve them. You would have to use some other tool to be able to retrieve them instead of the Outlook client. And then, of course, you can just not show the links at all if you wish. Down at the bottom, we also have one last thing to be configured associated with shortcut content, which is when you click on a shortcut, what do you wish to do? Well, typically you want to go ahead and show the contents of that particular item. Or if you're troubleshooting or something, you may need to actually just show the properties of that particular shortcut, which can include things such as the archive ID, which can help you in troubleshooting. But typically that's always going to be at show contents, and you hardly ever have to change that particular setting. Moving on to the shortcut deletion, which was the other thing we talked about as far as configuring for the mailbox policy. First, you can go through and specify whether or not you wish to delete the shortcut. And if you do decide that you do wish to delete the shortcut, you can specify the age at which you want to delete those shortcuts. Once again, the idea is when you delete the shortcut, we'll see later on, you can configure whether or not when the shortcut is deleted, whether or not the actual archived item is deleted. Shortcuts take up space, all right? So even though I'm moving the message and the attachments and everything else into that secondary storage world that Enterprise Vault brings to the table, the shortcut itself will take up space. So if I just left them there forever, I may actually reach my quota with nothing